Díag Margin, and you're all very welcome to Building a Resilient and Sustainable Supply Chain, part of our Global Ambition series of webinars. This is a very key topic at the moment, one that is certainly became more to the fore during the COVID crisis and its aftermath. And hopefully some of the presentations today will shed some light on some of the key issues, and you can take some information away in terms of possible solutions for assist with forecasting and future planning. Just by way of introduction to myself, my name is Mike Hogan. I'm a senior executive in Global Sourcing in Enterprise Ireland. Our role is primarily to develop linkages between AI, Enterprise Ireland client companies and foreign multinationals. And as you can imagine, the whole issue of supply chain and supply of services is one that's very key both to our own companies and to those very same foreign multinationals. Just to point out that we have a Q&A box at the end, at the bottom of the screen. So if you have any questions throughout the presentations, please feel free to put them in there, and we'll address them at the end of both the presentations. So without further ado, we're looking at a running time of approximately 50 minutes, 2 presentations and some time for a Q&A at the end. So my first task is to introduce my colleague, Ingrid de Doncker, who is co-founder and head of research and innovation at Future Planet. She has over 20 years experience in the area of supply chain and sustainable procurement. She lectures part-time at 3 Irish universities, and her views and thoughts on the subject are well sought out by both the public and the private sector. So if I can invite Ingrid to start her camera and to start her presentation, please.
Thanks, Mike, and I'm delighted to be here, and it'd be great if we could walk away with solutions. I think it's more a journey that we're going to walk through today. And first of all, I do want to say congrats. You all came through the past challenges, and we have had a few. You know, over the last 20 odd years, we've seen globalization, we've seen cost pressures. Brexit was a big one definitely for Ireland. We always have to deal with the tension, the geopolitical tension that the US, China always had, trade wars, and then we had COVID in between. So before we go anywhere, I want to give you a big congrats. You're still here, you came through it, you found solutions. The next slide will tell you also that we have current risks. Current risks are you have, because of the war in the Ukraine and natural disasters, you are dealing with disrupted supply chains. You have had to deal with changing customer demands because half of us had to go online to order our stuff. So we have changed our buying behavior, and you had to adapt. With that came cost inflation, and again, availability of product and reduction of transparency and visibility was a difficult one. And then also resource and talent shortages. Again, it was a new environment we all had to deal with. So you're managing it through. So again, well done. You found a way to deal with it, and you have adapted your business model. Now, there are some upcoming challenges. On the next slide, we will see that not only have you had to deal with financial repercussions, the climate change that we are dealing with and the sustainable growth of the business is the largest, and it's going to be the most challenging business transformation we will ever see. And don't take my word for it, but for the last three and a half years, I've been researching this area where the EU and the world is going from a directive point of view. And I'm only going to tell you a little bit about the context and the background today. I'm going to focus on a few of the directives that are coming your way, and these are legal requirements, and they're going to be phased. So I'm telling you, it's a journey. But behind all of this, it's time to prepare for the EU directives that are coming with the CSRD, with the EU taxonomy, but also from a national point of view, Ireland has a very ambitious national circular economy and national climate action plan. And what does that mean to your business? Next slide, please. So business disruption is happening everywhere, all around the world. There's environmental demands, and climate change is driving 80% of global companies to invest and report on sustainability. There's a lot of greenwashing going out there, so there's some elements that are coming up later, but 80% is saying, no, we need to put money in there. Employees are also voting with their feet, and they're working for purposeful companies. So 74% of employees that have been interviewed and participated in surveys said that they want to work for companies that are mindful to the environment and to the communities around them. We know there's so many global pressures, and it's continuously changing. Up to a week ago, there were more than 3,000 ESG laws, regulations, policies, metrics, and it's worldwide, and it's changing every day. We all understand, and we live in the same world. Personally and business-wise, we're living in a political changing environment. And again, the war of Ukraine has thrown a lot of uncertainty and disruption in there as well. But ultimately, what is going to happen, and banks are required to increase their green bonds. Your access to capital might be at risk if you don't take this climate change serious, and if you don't review your business model to include sustainable practices. We believe technology is the core of the transformation, because it needs to scale across, it needs to be standardized, and therefore there are digital solutions that a lot of really smart people are building. And you might be on the train of the AI and the ChatGPT, and it's great. I would use it in your business if you can. But next slide, please. And next to what is actually ESG and what is sustainability? ESG actually is the corporate governance framework. So if we can understand that companies need to adopt the ESG frameworks and consider the environmental, the social, and the governance aspect of their activities, alongside as well the financial, the economic aspect. And when I say their activities, it has also to do with the activities in the supply chain. A little bit more about that later. Sustainability then as a whole is more about meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And there's the seventh generation of the Iroquois Indians who would say that every decision we need to make today should actually be a good decision for the seventh generation coming. And I don't think we do that. I think we take very short-term decisions, so we can learn a lot from the old tribes and the old philosophies. Where sustainability is more the reasoning of the heart, the ESG then is more, so how do we measure? It's more the what do we need to do? Next slide, please. And I'm going through this like a train because I know Mike has a lot to say about this as well. But I can talk about this for days and days and days. But ultimately, I want to give you a little bit of background of what is coming. The E stands for the environmental. You all know that. How do companies manage their interaction with the environment? How prepared are you to face the challenges of climate change on your business? Carbon emissions are understood here. Water, air pollution, waste, renewable energy, resource depletion, biodiversity. And it's not only the climate on your business, but also your business decisions on the climate. There's a dual aspect to all of this, and it's called double materiality. The same with societal. How companies actually foster their own people and the culture. What impact have they or their decisions on the employees and the people in their value chain? And again, the ESG goes further than only your own workforce. It goes to the workforce in your supply chain. And you need to make sure that the decisions you make fall within the human rights legislation or the employee health and safety. DEI is coming very much to the fore. It's business ethics, stakeholder engagement, and community relations. And then finally, what do we understand around governance? Governance has everything to do with how companies are directed, controlled, and how leaders are accountable. Again, and you will have heard of Shell in the Netherlands, who have where the directors, the individual directors, are individually accountable now for greenwashing, and they're being pulled in front of court. So there is an individual accountability framework that you need to make sure that you're transparent around your executive compensation, the director's duties and due diligence, tax strategies, risks, opportunities, scenario planning. It's all a little bit frightening, but there's always, in risk, there's also opportunity. So I don't want to frighten you today. I just want to share with you what is coming down the track. If you're not already in it, then it's about to start the journey. Next slide, please. And we've all heard about the Sustainable Development Goals. In September 2015, there's 193 member states of the United Nations adopted a plan for achieving a better future for all. And it's laying out a plan, a path for the next 15 years to end extreme poverty, fight inequality and injustice, and protect our planet. At the heart of it is the Agenda of 2030 and these 17 development goals. And again, they were goals, clearly define the world we want, applying it to all nations, governance, regions, countries. Now, we're all in agreement on the world we want, and fulfilling these ambitions is an unprecedented effort. So it's great that this has been developed. However, these are goals. There were very little metrics behind it, and that has changed now. So the future has changed, and there's a lot of rules and regulation coming down the track. Next slide, please. So this is just an infographic of what actually is coming down the track, or what already has been developed and is being implemented. So we are looking at the mandatory human rights, the corporate sustainable due diligence, the CSDD, and it's called the CS3D. People who trade with Germany will also have heard about the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act there. We have the SFDR at the other side, which is all focusing around the financial implication. But today I want to focus a little bit about CSRD because it is going to impact everybody. Next slide, please. So the CSRD is an EU ESG standard, which has been passed by the EU Council only last year. And it's to make sustainability reporting more common, more standardized, consistent, and aligned with the financials. So there's 5 highlights actually, or 5 highlights. So we have double materiality. The double materiality is the double lens. How climate change is impacting your business, and how your business decisions are impacting the climate, the environment, but also the communities and the society around you. And that inwards outward look is very important. It's a must do. Looking back and looking forward, not only do we have to measure what we have done, we also have to include forward statements of what we're going to do. And that implies understanding your risks, opportunities, your action plans, your transition plans. It all needs to align, and both the sustainability and the financial statements need to now converge, especially around Scope 3. And we all know Scope 3 is happening in your supply chain, in your value chain. The CSRD is calling that it will need disclosure on your Scope 3 emissions. And then ultimately, there's a third-party assurance. So it needs to be externally assured, because the EU has, the aim of the CSRD is really eliminating the greenwashing. Ultimately, then it needs to be tagged online so that it's easy, reportable, and that it's transparent. And if there's anything that you take away from today, is that transparency becomes disclosure. You will need to be as transparent and open as possible, and that goes right into your supply chain. Next slide, please. So it's a phased implementation. The CSRD follows a phased plan of implementation. The bottom line, though, and you can see it here, and there's lots of information on Google, on ChatGPT, on wherever your sources direct you. The bottom line, though, is that by 2027, all SMEs, all companies with 10 people or more will have to report their sustainable strategy, their metrics, their action plans in line with the financial statements. International and non-EU companies with more than 150 million annual revenue within the EU will also have to comply. So it's beyond the EU regulation. Again, in the States, they're doing very similar exercise with the ISSB and the IFRS, and they're trying to align. They have a different focus. They're a lot more financially focused. We're a little bit more socially focused in Europe, but ultimately they will align. Next slide, please. This is only a holding slide just to show you how they think about what the modules and what the focus is, what they're thinking about when they say you need to report under CSRD. So CSRD is the law that requires eligible companies to issue annual sustainability reports in line with their financial statements, where the ESRS, the EU Sustainability Reporting Standards, outlines how and what information and which ESG metrics companies need to report on to comply with the CSRD. So that's the core difference. The CSRD is already in place and has a phased implementation. ESRS is still in development. They only have developed 2 modules at the moment, ESRS 1, the general principles and the general disclosures. But what I want to draw your attention on is you will see here under the environment, we have climate change. It's also, and which includes the carbon and the GHG emission. It's also going back into your supply chain. Under social, you will see here as well that it's focusing on the workers in your value chain. It's not only your own workforce. You now need to report also on the workers in your supply chain, and also how you measure and you track your consumers and end users. It's stretching it fully out over your supply chain. Next slide, please. And if that wasn't difficult enough, there's a lot of amendments being made as well coming this year on the product compliance. So ultimately, it's going right up from product environmental footprinting all the way up to the supply chain at its different stages, because there's a huge buried risk in the supply chain that the EU want to uncover and make sure that we have the least environmental and social impact. So there's a lot happening, and more is coming every day. Next slide, please. So what actually is a sustainable supply chain? Well, as you can imagine, it's embedding the environmental, social, and governance and economic principles into the value chain for a positive impact. But it's looking throughout all the different phases in your supply chain. It's from sourcing, production, distribution, all the way to the end of the life cycle of the product, to optimize the product value and to optimize the impact. It's also seen as a method to reduce both the cost and the scope of 3 emissions in your supply chain. And we can do this because we need to reduce the cost while also delivering a positive impact. And ultimately, this shouldn't cost more. It looks like it's going to cost more, but it shouldn't cost more if you do sustainable supply chain well. Next slide, please. Just a holder to come back to that dual approach. the double materiality. So what will you do to adapt your business, your model of trading with your supply chain to reduce the impact of climate change? So what is climate change impact? How is climate change impacting my business? And how then do my business decisions impact the climate, my supply chain, the environment, and society? So that dual aspect, the double materiality, is key. Don't only say, oh, I need to make sure that I have sustainable growth in my business, and therefore I need to mitigate, adapt what I need to adapt to the new climate change. It's also about you mitigating your impact on the environment and on your communities. Next slide, please. So when customers come to us, they say, where do we start? It's so big. It's difficult, and it is complex. But a lot of things you already have in your arsenal, the tools you already have available to you, and we say you just focus on the priorities that matter to you. Sustainable procurement, sustainable logistic, you move boxes from one side to the other, human rights and stakeholders. If your business has more people than product, then definitely you need to make sure that you extend all your human rights and your workers' rights and benefits across. Definitely GHG Scope 3, it's all about reducing the carbon, and circular economy and waste is actually a good way to start. When we're asked to help them, we look at how can we help business develop their strategy, what is the gap to good, what are their action plans to transition, and how do they need to report. Next slide, please. And again, I'm just focusing on two elements, and then I'm going to hand over to Mike. So we all know the linear production phases, and there's primary responsibilities and there's secondary responsibilities. Most of the time, whoever buys has the primary responsibility because they develop the specification, and the company and the customers are obviously, it's the company that developed the specification, the supplier supplies, and the customer buys. Throughout the different phases, there's a primary and secondary responsibility switch. And you can imagine it's multi-layered, but it cannot be linear anymore, because ultimately at the end of the linearity, we have a lot of waste, and we now need to change that into a circular thinking. Next slide, please. So the circular thinking for us is a lot more about reshaping how we think about the value of a product. It's reshaping our supply chains for a sustainable future. And a sustainable circular supply chain is where we use products for their parts, and they are being returned and repurposed and processed so they can be repaired, resold, refurbished, recycled, which reduces the waste in the supply chain. It reduces the cost of the supply chain. But it starts with designing out waste and designing in modularity. And circular supply chain are at the heart of effort to tackle this massive environmental problem created by waste and end-of-life products. The circular supply chain has many lines in between. So at any point in time, you have waste. At any point in time, you can redirect. At any point in time, there's opportunities. And until today, supply chain have worked very tightly in a structured way, interlinked, where now we need to start looking at collaborating a lot more between the phases in the supply chain. Next slide, please. And when we do that and we embed sustainability in it, then we can impact positively on our human rights and stakeholders, which is across all the phases of our supply chain. The greenhouse gas, same, we can impact, we can reduce from design up to end of life the carbon emissions that our products and our supply chain has. And we can do this by implementing sustainable procurement. There is an ISO 20400 that is really clear of how you do this. There's circular economy that is really impactful, which makes you review your business model and focuses on reducing the waste, but it gives you ultimate new revenue streams. You can build new revenue streams as a result of thinking circular economy. And then ultimately it's about making sure that you take the least path of costs to the environment and social, of moving the boxes from one side of the world to the other. Next slide, please. Now, the biggest focus, as you will hear, is coming to reduce the greenhouse gases. And you all have heard of the greenhouse gases. It's actually the effect of the way that the heat is being trapped close to the Earth's surface, and it is by the greenhouse gases. So we all have to reduce them. They're divided in 3 different scopes. Scope 1, which is happening in your business. Scope 2 is what you buy from an electricity and an energy point of view. But the biggest scope of the greenhouse gases is Scope 3. Between 50 to 70% of the greenhouse gases are in your upstream, everything you buy from your suppliers, and your downstream, everything you sell to your customers. That's where the biggest carbon or greenhouse gases is produced. And so it's the biggest opportunity we can reduce. It's the hardest to tackle. And it starts with uncovering your full supply chain map. Next slide, please. So it's not always easy, but it definitely is worthwhile. There's challenges, there's a lot of complexity, and there's limited visibility. We need to uncover our full supply chain. There's also a lack of how to do this. So sustainable procurement definitely is a first step that I would recommend. There's poor tools to assess ESG maturity. Again, where you start is very important. And again, there's different regulations, but the majority of us is working within a European framework and a European context. And definitely the CSRD is then the one to watch. It's hard to collect Scope 3 data from your suppliers, but collaboration is the only way, and it's transparency of data and the whole supply chain, and it goes right back to China or to the other side of the world, or one little TVS or rectifiers can fly 10 times around the world before it comes here. But that's what we need to stop. Those are bad trading practices. They're not sustainable, and we need to stop that. There's lots of benefits. Sustainable procurement alone can reduce between 5 and 20% of the cost. So again, focus on buying better so that you have money to implement other initiatives. Reducing the impact of GHG not only safeguard the biodiversity, and we've all heard about COP27, it also will make sure that we preserve our land and our forests. Supports human rights, it reduces labor abuses, and ultimately it's about reducing our waste across the life cycle of our supply chain. Next slide, please. And we're nearly there. I always want to focus on the benefits. There is benefits, and don't believe that, like, these are not my number. These are numbers from OECD, the United Nations, from MIT, INSEAD. You can save 10% when you reduce your waste and improve your energy efficiency. You can increase your revenue by 11% once you focus on giving ancillary, not ownership models, but usership models, for example, as a result of circular economy. The inclusive culture definitely will reduce your level of employee turnover and higher engagement. And think about the cost of training up people. There's a huge cost associated with that. Companies do better when you comply. So 4%, or you can have an increase of 4% in your financial performance when you're compliant. And ultimately, the return on investment that you will see is creating a 6.1% increase on new customers and new investors. Again, do not underestimate the attractiveness of a sustainable business for investors. Investors are driving this as well from there, and it's not only the customers, also the investors. Consumers want this. So 75% state that they want to buy more sustainable products. Apart from that, last week, only last week, the EU has proposed the Green Claim Directive, which, if it's being passed, it will be able to fine companies that are greenwashing up to 4% of their annual profit. It can bar you from being part of public procurement contracts. It can bar you, it can terminate your public funding, including grants and concessions. So not only there are benefits, there are absolutely elements that you need to consider embedding sustainability. So next slide, please. For me, it's about getting started. Map your life cycle of all your products throughout all the supply chain stages. And when you map, don't forget to do a carbon footprint map as well. Ask your suppliers, ask the suppliers of your suppliers to start carbon footprinting. Start to understand the number, the carbon number. Like you have a financial cost, there's a carbon cost, there's a social cost. We all need to become very aware of those three financial criteria, because they'll all be turned into financial criteria. Assess your supply chain, start implementing sustainable procurement practices. And there's lots of different voluntary guides like the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, science-based targets, the GHG reduction plans. Make sure when you buy, when you engage, share your targets around water, waste, carbon, your workforce, share them with your customers, with your suppliers. Start talking about a sustainable supply chain. Collaborate across them to agree reduction targets. And there's a lot of quick wins there, a lot of quick wins. Design waste reduction plans and establish how you're going to measure. And finally, you know, I can leave you with some tools. Start doing materiality assessment. What is important? Prioritize what is important to your business. Then again, develop your visibility map. Make sure you understand your full supply chain, and also engage all your stakeholders, your customers and your suppliers. Start doing SWOT analysis, utilize the total cost of ownership and the total life cycle cost to uncover the risk and opportunities. And there's multiples. And develop scenario business modeling. So you understand when there is an increase, there's disruption to your own supply chain and it's costing you an awful lot more to do your business, that you have built contingency and continuity plans. Because ultimately, this is about increasing the resilience of your supply chain to strengthen your own business. I've thrown an awful lot at you, and I can give you lots more details. So if there's any further questions, just contact me, and I will have questions and answer later. But thank you so much for listening. Mike, back to you.
Thanks, Ingrid. Certainly a lot of food for thought there, not just in terms of what's the right thing to do and the most, economically sensible thing to do, but also in terms of what's coming down the line in terms of the compliance and regulatory risks as well. But yeah, thanks very much for that. And that I suppose is a useful segue into the next section, where we're really kind of just looking at the current kind of landscape out there at the moment. And this very much reflects the experience of Enterprise Ireland clients at the moment and some of the issues they're facing. We've obviously come out of a COVID pandemic that's in many cases fractured global supply chains, and also made people think again a little bit about how they get supplies to them, timelines, how much stock they hold, etc. And I think a lot of people last year rolled out of that pandemic thinking that they were beginning to re-enter the world in terms of a kind of a normalization before events in Ukraine and the war there, and the effects of high energy prices, likewise inflation activities, some of which were being predicted. I mean, there's historical evidence often that after pandemics can be a boom, but I suppose the boom in this case got fractured by world events. And I think one of the things that's happened, and can we go to the next slide, please? has been for companies to fundamentally re-examine their supply chains. And certain themes have become self-evident. One is the idea of localization, shortening your supply chain to make it both more sustainable, but also to lessen the kind of time lag and the risk by having some products and some inputs closer to home. Diversification. Again, it's as simple as not putting all your eggs in one basket and having an over-reliance on one particular supplier. And here we're seeing examples of companies engaging with additional suppliers at a lower level to keep them on standby. So to maintain a relationship with suppliers that's kind of multi-supplier led, even if some of those suppliers are not are very much in the subsidiary scale. Digitalization, and again, you hear lots of comments here about how 5 years of digitalization or 6 years of digitalization was pumped. It was pressed into the whole period of COVID, etc. But one of the key things that has emerged is that companies are the data requirements that a lot of suppliers now have to provide to be able to merge or be part of the supply chain of larger entities has become much more significant, both in terms of issues in terms of sustainability reporting, but also in terms of timing, where products are, and where how at what point in the supply chain they're at. And we're getting to see, I suppose, a move from what was the ubiquitous just-in-time process for many companies for many years to just in case. So companies are holding additional inventories, and that creates both opportunities and costs in the sense that not only are the companies having to have the additional working capital to have that additional inventory, but they also have to manage that inventory when it's in place. So next slide, please. So again, as part of this process, I would have conducted conversations across the Enterprise Ireland network globally and with clients to understand a little bit more about where their pain points are, what supply issues, and those supply issues are not simply physical input and products. They're to do with services, and in many cases they're to do with human capital as well and resources. So next slide, please. So what's local? And this is, when the idea of local meaning local, I suppose people principally think of the home market. They think of Ireland, but as companies begin to nearshore more, they're beginning to look more in terms of what our local is, and local for Ireland in many cases is 2-3 hours flying time or accessible points from Ireland. And as an example here, I can reference the automotive sector. So if we think back to, let's say, the late 80s, early 90s, you would have seen a lot of automotive manufacturing and the supply side that goes with it move into countries like Spain, Portugal, etc., outside of the major previous legacy manufacturing centers. We move into the 2000s, and you see those self-same manufacturing and supply centers move into countries like Poland, Hungary, Czech, Slovakia. More laterally, certain moves south down into the Balkans, countries like Romania and Bulgaria. In this case, it's got companies are chasing a combination of expertise on the ground, but also certain price points that they want to reach. And more laterally, that's that movement has moved towards what we can usefully call a Mediterranean lake, which is seeing in automotive terms, automotive move into countries like Morocco, which will be producing, for example, 1 million units of automotive cars in the next 2 to 3 years. Countries like into Egypt, where they're supplying some of those big red buses that go into London. So the supply chain is moving, and people is within the EU. We obviously have a common single market, but also the fact that we have across the Mediterranean a single customs zone, which is also playing its part in where people are going to look for opportunities and supply. The other factor, of course, in the background has been Brexit. So, and luckily we have had, in one sense, the reaction to Brexit has been to create additional routes into the continent, and that's with those ferry and cargo routes both into not just France, but Holland and Spain, have certainly opened up opportunities for a lot of our clients to examine new suppliers. And that's not forgetting, I suppose, that's, the traditional one-stop shop approach that we've seen in China. A lot of our clients are still heavily embedded in China, though COVID was a kind of a wake-up call in the fragility of those relationships. And what we're seeing, and this is not my term, but people have come up with a term of alt Asia, which is looking at other countries in Asia, which, while they may not be able to supply all the aspects of China in terms of a one-stop shop, that they can be combined to bring together, the necessary inputs that people require for their businesses. And a lot of things that's been driven too by the higher wage costs in China, and that's driven particularly countries where it comes to the fore, such as Vietnam, in terms of production, but also in terms of service and kind of back-end services. Countries like the Philippines have come to the fore as well. So it's a constantly changing environment. And I suppose the key takeaway, I suppose, we have from our clients is that they're looking at both longer and shorter supply chains, operating those in combination. And also that, activities around supply chain is an all-time continuous activity. It's not something you do because you lose a supplier. It's something that should be going on in the background on a continuous basis. Next slide, please. So my final slide is really to deal with some of the tools that can be applied when we're looking at the supply side. Enterprise Ireland as an entity is an export agency primarily overseas. So essentially, we're not really in the business of finding supply in countries that we operate in. We often know about supply by reference to the fact that we're in the market. But realistically, a lot of the work that suppliers can do, our clients can do, but also companies in general can do, is not rocket science. And there are very, very standardized ways of reaching new suppliers on a continuous basis. The first off is our own market research center, the Enterprise Ireland HQ in Dublin, which has is one of the best in class in terms of information availability. Trade shows continue, and especially in a post-COVID world where people are suddenly wanting to be out and about, trade shows, particularly in sectors such as engineering, kind of physical components side of the house, is very, very important, and a very important source of new supply opportunities. The other section, I suppose, is that Enterprise Ireland is the Irish export agency, whereas every other country in the world has possibly some other variation of Enterprise Ireland. So interacting with the commercial sections of foreign embassies that are either in Dublin or are accredited out of London, for example, typically is a very good conduit, because they will have the latest information from their side in terms of companies in their countries that want to export into Ireland and are looking for potential partners. The other piece of the equation that we tend to use in a lot of countries as well is the Chambers of Commerce and Industry. I suppose if you live in Ireland and you have the idea of Chambers Ireland, which has kind of really evolved as an organization, the Chambers of Commerce and Industry in a lot of the countries across Central Eastern Europe and into North Africa and farther afield are much more traditional in what they do. They look like, I suppose, what Chambers of Commerce did in Ireland maybe 20, 30 years ago. But they, in many cases, all have a function where they can be contacted, and they can, in many cases, do searches of their own membership. And in many countries, the membership of the Chamber of Commerce Industry is actually mandatory. So it's a very useful repository of companies that are supplying product, and could be applicable for supply. I would say, though, that they're mostly applied to what you might call traditional sectors, big business, engineering, chemicals, raw materials. Whereas if you're looking at in terms of a resource in terms of software or ICT or programmers or you name it, then the trade body that's responsible in country for that activity tends to be the standalone place to go. So whatever it is, the national equivalent of ICT Ireland or Software Ireland in those countries. Bilateral trade organizations, any large countries that we do business with tends to have a voluntary Irish local entity, whether it's called a trade association or a business circle or a chamber of commerce. They're also very, very useful points of contact in terms of finding new suppliers. British trade bodies are useful from the point of view that Britain went through a cycle of having its own people on the ground in terms of public servants to utilizing business or British business and chambers of commerce on the ground for a period of time. And then they've recently changed their operation to move back to a more public service focused model for servicing the needs of British companies looking to export overseas. So it means that a lot of entities have been left behind looking for new sources of income. So those bodies are quite useful. Certainly, we would have used the equivalent British trade body in Chamber of Commerce in Turkey, for example, to do some searches in particular. So those are entities that have been built up to do searches for British companies and now are looking for additional sources of business, and they're useful points of contact in terms of doing those searches. And also, you'll tend to find the professional organizations that are out there to help you actually source a product as well. I would say, though, that there's a lot of this work that you can do yourself, even as something as simple as utilizing web search, because putting what you're looking for into the foreign language and then searching for it often brings up an array of possibilities. And sometimes you're looking at websites overseas that don't particularly look great, but in fact are the kind of the reservoir of where a lot of supply comes from. So doing search that way, and then typically finding someone within the supplying company that speaks English or you can communicate with is often a very useful first step. At least in keeping a dialogue going with additional suppliers that you could use and call upon at a future date. A lot of our clients also tend to really